Our guests today are Lily Brown, partner of WilmerHale here in Washington, D.C. Lily spent 14 years working at the SEC, senior special counsel to CorpFin Director Meredith Cross, and David Kanarek, who's vice president and group counsel in the general counsel's organization of American Express Company up in New York. I'm Brock Romanak. We're going to talk risk factors today on Zippy Point. So updating risk factors, this is what every company is going to have to do with the change in the SEC's rules and regs, because if you're an existing public company, you have some risk factors out there. So I think it's obvious, given the liability protection purposes of risk factors, that inevitably the risk factor disclosure should speak as of the date that you file your 10Q, your 10K, not the end of the reporting period. Is that right, Lily?
That's right. That's the short answer, yes. The longer answer is, the risk factors are going to be fluid and living up until you file your K or your quarterly report. You don't want to be in a position of filing a document that you know that doesn't capture the material risks for the company and its investors. And as you're thinking about kind of trending risks and whether they're sufficiently material for disclosure, you want to be kind of looking down the road and thinking about the kind of the 2020 hindsight bias that may apply when disclosures are reviewed by the market or the SEC in the future. And so kind of thinking, okay, does this, has something that's happened during our drafting period impact what our disclosure should be? So it's not bound, the risk factor kind of item requirement, it's not bound by the reporting period covered by the report. And beyond that, it's to your benefit, right, to capture the risks in the most complete way possible, because it's protecting the company, right? It's an SEC disclosure requirement, but it's also protecting the company. So you want to have the most complete and current risk factor disclosure that you can from an anti-fraud and liability standpoint. So you have an incentive to be putting the cautionary language in there for folks to be able to assess the risk of investment or continuing to hold, or thinking about in terms of voting decisions. So back to the yes, there's not the requirement goes up until you file, and you also, just as a practical standpoint, want to be including the most comprehensive and current risks when you file.
And there's historically been two schools of thought. That one, companies have their laundry list of all of their risk factors in each 10Q, and then even if there's updates, they're just going to be in part of the laundry list of 10Q of the risk factors they have in that 10Q. And then the second group are those companies that just provide the updated risk factors in a 10Q. They don't include the entire laundry list. David, what's your thinking on all of this?
Yeah, let's start with the rule itself. So in Form 10Q, you're supposed to set forth any material change from risk factors that are previously disclosed in the 10K. So narrowly read, you would think you were just to put forth your material changes. And you're right, practice is mixed here, though. I think a lot of companies do repeat their full risk factor set in each Q and continually, even maybe where there's no material update, because you can still make wording changes, immaterial changes. And while that causes you to go through that process, you could think about it as good hygiene. Every 3 months, you're looking back and revisiting the disclosure and making sure it's most up to date. As Lily was mentioning, bringing it down, even if there's not something that's materially changed. On the other hand, there is a process that you have to go through in order to do that. And if you really have nothing material to say that's different, you can also just rely on your existing risk factor package from the 10K. We've seen this quite a bit, obviously during this current year, where things are so fast moving in 2020. And I think you're seeing a lot more of these material changes as companies have been filing their 10K.
And Lily, what's been your experience with the drafting process when companies are considering updating or crafting new risk factors?
So as with any disclosure, the process is going to be different at different companies. It depends on the size of your team, how much you rely on outside counsel, complexity of your organization and business, but there are certainly some constants. So the first is you need to sit down and say, okay, what may have happened over this quarterly period that may render my existing risk factors, right, the ones that are already out there, no longer complete. It may, you may need a whole new risk factor, or you may need to revise an existing risk factor. So in some cases, that's going to be obvious, right? For example, a new pandemic. It's going to be something that it's top of mind for everyone. And we certainly saw that in the spring. In other cases, in most cases, it's going to be a more systematic process and more specific to your organization, right? And I'll just say it up front so that it's top of mind before I kind of talk more about process. Strong disclosure controls and procedures are important, right? You always want to have those top of mind with any of your disclosures, and that's equally the case for risk factors. You're going to end up needing a lot of coordination and consultation across the enterprise, depending again on how you organize it, buy-in among the disclosure committee, the drafting teams in legal and financial reporting, business folks, executive team. Best case scenario, you're able to do some pretty significant brainstorming on whether there are new risks that need to be reflected in the document, or if there are some that need to be changed or deleted. And you do want to be talking to, the senior management team leaders, the members, the leads of the different, business functions, operating units, divisions, to kind of find out what's happening in each of those groups that may result in new risk factor or changed risk factor disclosure. So kind of finding out what the leads throughout your organization are worrying about. Kind of the buckets that you look at in thinking about this are going to be, events that the company has experienced over the last quarter, right? So using cybersecurity, because that's always kind of the go-to and the easy one for risk factor disclosure. Have you experienced breaches or attempted breaches? Were they material? I'll say on that one, and we'll talk about it with something like cybersecurity. Odds are everyone has experienced an attempted breach. So the question will be, were they material? Does your disclosure already say that you have? And we'll talk about hypothetical risk factors and how not to have those. But basically just looking at what's happened to us over the last quarter, does it reflect a material risk that is not already captured in our disclosures? Are there events, that have happened to an industry peer, other companies, supplier, business partner? Is there something there that could be relevant to your company that, again, is not already captured in the risk factors? And then there are the external factors. We talked about the macro risks. You may have evolution of law, regulation, practice. So you want to be looking out into the market, looking at statements by regulators, looking at change in law. We saw a little while back the chairman of the SEC and also the Corp Fin director really specifically saying, hey, we're looking for disclosures in the area of the LIBOR changes or cybersecurity or Brexit. So you want to be attuned to what's happening outside the company as well, and making sure that you're kind of reflecting those. And, market practice, we're not all lemmings. We don't all want to do what everyone else is doing, but we kind of do, right? We don't want to we want to be specific to our companies, and our business, but at the same time, we don't want to be off market too. So it's good to at least know what's happening out with the marketplace, and to the extent that there is something that's material for your company, making sure that you're reflecting it, because you don't want to kind of be caught out as someone who was not with the market in terms of your disclosure. So then you're going to go back and you're going to look and say, okay, have I captured all of this? And ultimately, some combination of your legal and financial reporting team will be actually doing the drafting, often in consultation with outside counsel, often not. And then you'll run through the review process with your internal experts and leadership, kind of following the process in your particular company. Again, really cognizant of the importance of your disclosure controls and procedures. And thinking about, if there's something special I talked about internal specialists. It could be your litigation team if it's a litigation related risk. So you just really have to think about the nature of the risk and who within your organization are going to be best equipped to review and help you to.
Yeah, there might be many layers of review. It really depends on the situation and also
Absolutely.
the time that you have to do that. So David, how does this work that if you have a new or an updated risk factor like in the first quarter, so that's in your first quarter 10Q, in your second and third quarter 10Qs, if you don't have any new developments about that topic, do you still need to include that particular updated or new risk factor in those second and third quarter 10Qs?
Yeah, I think the better read of that Form 10Q requirement that you don't have to include any updates unless there's material updates from your 10K would necessitate either stating that same risk factor that had come up or there was a material change in the first quarter in your second and third quarter 10Qs. Or you can accomplish that, though, with a hyperlink cross-reference back to your first quarter 10Q.
And then Lily, if you have a quarter where you have nothing new, no new updates for an existing risk factor or no new risk factor, do you have to have what I call negative disclosure? Some people call it affirmative disclosure, but basically disclosure saying there's nothing to report here.
You do not have to, but many folks do. I think practice is pretty mixed in this space. Most of the time risks aren't going to change significantly quarter to quarter. And, if you're not one of those companies that restates the risk factors in each Q, you likely are going to be encountering this more quarters than not. Probably, hopefully. And so, this is one where there is kind of standard language that you'll often see here that says, no material changes from the risks stated in our 10K. But at the end of the day, it's not a requirement. And so practice is mixed.
How about using a 10Q to actually eliminate the killer risk factor? So it would basically say the development is that we no longer consider this a risk.
You can do that. I mean, it's part of kind of the overall evaluation that you do on a quarterly basis as to whether or not your risk factors capture the current risks that the company is exposed to. But it's not particularly common. It's kind of one of those things that you maybe are going to see a lot more frequently, or you are going to see more frequently in kind of the big housekeeping review that happens at the K. Yes, you are required to look at your risk factors quarterly, but this is one where it can look a little awkward. It can be hard to do in that way. And oftentimes, it's a little bit subjective as to when that risk is really going to fall off. So it may not feel like something affirmative enough has happened to cause it to fall off such that you would say, we're taking this out. It may be clear just from, within the marketplace already that a risk isn't there. And at the end of the day, also, this goes back to, kind of the concept of pulling risks out that maybe you've had for a long time. They're general. It's hard to get rid of risks, and it feels like a higher risk. Whereas we may say, okay, well, we need to add a new risk this quarter. It feels like a lower risk proposition to just continue on with a risk factor that maybe isn't so important anymore. So maybe you'll just tidy that up at the end of the year. So yes, you can do it. Most people do not.
And what about a risk that's very material that actually pops up in the middle of a quarter? Have you seen companies, or would you recommend that companies use an 8K to actually add or change a risk factor as it changes, or would you file an amendment maybe to the last 10Q or 10K to accomplish that? So
you are going to see instances where there is an off-cycle need to update risk factors. Big events don't always happen on your perfect quarterly schedule. So you will at times find out of cycle needs to kind of update the risk factors to maintain the accuracy and completeness of information. You see this in, when companies are in the market raising capital in particular. You really want to make sure that you have the risks incorporated into the registration statement. We saw a lot of this in the spring with COVID. That was a big new risk, right? That happened at a time when many folks were out there with registration statements. So you do see that happening in an 8K, an 801 8K, so that it gets incorporated by reference into the 33 Act filing versus a 701 that you would do just because you want it out there for FD purposes. But if you actually want to get it into the filings, you do that on an 801. So we do see that occasionally. You do not amend the prior K or Q to do it. You do it via an 8K, and then when it comes time for your next Q, you can reflect it there, and then you figure out with the K whether you want whether it's going to go into the risk factors overall.
So as a disclosure lawyer, risk factors is one of my favorite disclosures. Updating them is for me, it's easier to write a risk factor from scratch than to continually tweak it. And I think most lawyers find that with any disclosure, it's easier to do it the first time when the event's fresh. But I don't know how you feel about that.
I personally like to see some options and then draft my own. But yeah, I mean, it can be hard once you have language that you've been living with or that others have blessed. It's hard to change that. But I think that's going to be person by person as to how much they like to start with a blank sheet of paper.
Thank you very much.